I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
On today's episode, I speak with Hudson CEO John Walters about his recent trips to Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine, and how all three theaters represent opportunities for the United States to prove we are up to the task of deterring conflict from our adversaries.
It doesn't cost anything to say Xi Jinping is a tyrant. Xi Jinping does not represent the legitimate aspirations of the Chinese people. It doesn't cost anything to say that Vladimir Putin is a tyrant and a kleptocrat. He is stealing and distorting the Russian nation in a way that is horrifying. The way and killing political opponents, sending men to their death. Without regard to the safety of their own soldiers and citizens. That's the truth. I mean, I know sometimes people don't like to talk about the truth because somehow it seems so black and white. But this is unavoidable. These are not debatable propositions. They're obvious to everybody. And when you state them, that undermines the capacity and the political power of our adversaries. So do it.
We also discuss his work on drug policy and the broader context for Hudson's approach to America's geostrategic challenges. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. John Walters, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you, Marshall. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you. So I want to start by discussing three recent trips you've completed. You went to Ukraine, you went to Taiwan, and you went to Israel. These are essentially the three hottest geopolitical spots that folks are going to be focused on. I'd love for you just to kind of open by describing those trips, differences, takeaways, and what kind of brings these together narratively.
Yeah, well, thank you. I took different parts of the Hudson staff with me to first Israel. We were actually trying to schedule the trip in December and circumstances didn't allow it, so we went in January. And we wanted to talk to the Israelis about the strategy going forward for, kind of reestablishing deterrence and trying to defend our allies in the Middle East. It's been a shocking failure of I think, preparedness both on the part of the United States and Israel. And they were trying to rethink how they structure their own security, but it's a partnership. I mean, we're a huge and important ally in the Middle East, and in fact, Hudson's going to do a conference here with Israelis in the next short little while here to try to rethink our military and security alliance. That needs to be done. I think the other thing that I took away from that trip was there's a tendency to think of deterrence as something that you kind of build and it's static. And deterrence is really more like, what we used to call low-intensity conflict all the time. As long as you have an aggressive adversary, they're always probing. Where they find weakness, they try to exploit it. And sometimes they do it in explosive and horrifying ways, as the Hamas attack in Gaza. But, they're always built, the Iranian-backed proxies in the region, are Hezbollah is placing missiles in Gaza. We went up to our missiles in Golan. We went up to the Golan Heights near the line at that time. They're causing shifts in population, disruption to the Israeli economy, also a giant threat. Israel has built an impressive technological capability with Iron Dome, but the Hamas and Hezbollah have used human shields as their Iron Dome, and that creates a moral hazard for the United States and Israel, as they know. But also, it doesn't change the threat. You have to deal with the threat, and Israel is trying to do that now in Gaza, and we're not helping. Frankly, we're continuing to suggest measures that are not in keeping with Israel's security or, frankly, the United States security, and we're not helping in regard to the Middle East. We're not pushing back on the central sponsors of this terrorism, an enabler, which is Iran, and that's spreading now. It's spreading to shipping in the Persian Gulf and in shipping routes, and it's also spreading to every place from Iraq and Syria to the Houthi attacks you see across a variety of the Middle East. So we're failing to conceptualize properly the threat here. We're going to continue to work on that, and I think that's a gigantic problem, and it's a gigantic problem with the fact that the chief adversaries of the United States and our allies in the world are uniting. I think you see that with the Communist Party in China supporting Russia, friendship forever, providing weapons, providing other support, Russia providing energy and other supports, uniting with Iran and Iranian influence in the Middle East growing because of China. And Iran is providing technology and weapons to Russia in its war with Ukraine. And you see even North Korea joining in and providing weapons and support. So our adversaries have united, and it is still a constant problem in Washington to have our key elected officials in Congress and in the executive branch kind of see the actual threat here and deal with it as the strategic problem it is. We went to Taiwan in February. We've had a long-term relationship working on security problems in the Indo-Pacific and with Taiwan specifically. We had honored the current president and outgoing president in New York in February of last year, it was an opportunity for us to meet the incoming democratically elected, under all kinds of stress from the Chinese communist disinformation campaigns, security threats, and others, a free and fair election, an election that showed a kind of power of technology to try to neutralize information warfare that the Chinese aggressively tried to do against the Taiwanese population. We saw a strong country, but a country that also depends on the United States. There's a lot of talk in Washington about, what weapon systems we should provide Taiwan, and is that in conflict with what we're trying to do to help others, Ukraine, Israel, and others. But I mean, ultimately, if the Chinese communist leadership decides to attack Taiwan, the only effective response is United States hard power. I mean, that means our Navy, our Air Force, our air, sea, and space assets are going to have to be used to defend Taiwan. It's a small country with a gigantic adversary. Now, we can do that, and we are trying to grow our capacity. And part of the reason for the trip was to look at some of the work we've been doing in our team doing defense technology and strategy on unmanned systems that are expendable, that can be used to create an enormously greater complex problem for any kind of attack on Taiwan. Also, some of these technologies allow some of our allies in the region. We also had a team, I was not on this trip, that went to Japan recently, our allies in the region to use their technological prowess to create weapon systems that don't just depend on the United States, that give them independence. You see some of this happening in Ukraine, for example. So you can multiply both the capacities and I think the innovation that's inherent in what we're seeing in a revolution in warfare that will help to protect and rebuild deterrence and our ability to push back. Lastly, earlier this month, I was in Ukraine with a team to look at the situation there. One of the things that you hear in opposition to the level of support we're trying to provide Ukraine is that there isn't a plan, that this is endless, expensive, and costly, not in American or NATO blood, but in Ukrainian blood, which is obviously an important matter. But the Ukrainians do have a plan. What they've been doing, and I think some of this has been miscast, is taking away the power of the Russians to first strangle Ukraine by cutting off the port of Odessa and shipping out of the country. Secondly, the Ukrainians have weakened the capacity of the Russians to attack them from the sea by basically sinking almost a third of the Black Sea fleet and pinning down assets even that came from the north into the Black Sea and now can't be removed and replaced. Also, they have been destroying huge numbers of aircraft. The Russians don't fly aircraft into Ukraine now because they lose them, including very scarce, large, and expensive command and control aircraft, which have been attacked both in the air and on the ground in places. Now the Ukrainians are also attacking refining capability. Estimates are they've now cut by 10% the refining capability for oil of the Russians, a big source of money. And, as everybody knows, there have been huge losses of personnel and equipment by the Russian army. Even though they are much bigger than the Ukrainians have radically reduced the threat to NATO, at least in terms of that kind of equipment and manpower. So the real danger is that the Ukrainians, too, being smaller, are in need of our weapons. And what we're not doing, moving because of our own now political situation, but also I think confusion about the threat, we're not providing the weapon systems they need to win. So they're isolating the Russians. They're taking apart the key abilities to strike. And we were there and met with officials that are doing some of the greatest technological change. The Ukrainians are going to create 1 million unmanned aerial vehicles that they can use to attack the Russians this year. They have built the industrial base to do that. And those systems are now changing the shape of battle. What they don't have and what we can provide is the interceptors for air attack. We were in Odessa, we were in Kyiv. I mean, every night there was attacks on the city, alarms and interception. The Russians are trying to create strike packages that cause them to bleed air defense, and they can then use those systems to attack both infrastructure, but they're also now making the Ukrainians pull some of the air defense away from the battlefront in order to protect major infrastructure and population areas. That's a strategy we can help them overcome with the proper supplies, but our delay is costing lives.
I'd be curious, could you define what the Ukrainians see as victory in the case of the country? And then from your perspective, how do you define victory from the United States' perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And there's a lot of confusion about what's possible for a settlement of this conflict one way or the other. For the Ukrainians, they want the Russians off their territory. That includes the territory taken in 2014. So that includes Crimea, it includes eastern provinces and so forth. And that's the political expectation of, I think, the Ukrainian people by all accounts. And I think the possibility of that, depends on the ability to kind of push the Russians back and create untenable situations. I mean, they are striking targets on Crimea. They are pushing the logistic support from Russia, both in conquered territory or occupied territory and into Russia. I think from our point of view and from NATO's point of view, the issue has to be, well, we need to have a Russia that is that loses for this aggression. How much of the occupied territory that's taken may be an issue, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to create leverage over Putin, you have to let the Ukrainians continue to push back. And I think there are a variety of vulnerabilities here for Putin that they can take. They can isolate Crimea. We've even published a report about dropping certain logistical ties, the Kerch Bridge and other things. And in some ways, the Ukrainians have kind of done that with, they've destroyed a third of the Black Sea fleet, and Ukraine doesn't have a navy. Mm-hmm. They've done this all with drones and with aerial attacks and rockets. It's a real revolution. I don't know that I've heard some experts say that never in history has such an extensive naval victory been possible without a navy, a counter navy. So this is a lesson. But also, I think part of this is we're not thinking clearly about what it's necessary to try to bring this to a conclusion. The Ukrainians have asked for a path to get into NATO. We gave them assurances. The Europeans gave them assurances when they gave up, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they gave up the nuclear weapons that were from the Soviet era in their country, that we would protect their security. We didn't honor that in 2014, and NATO didn't honor that. I think if you want them to, any kind of resolution requires us to give them a guarantee that looks more reliable than the past guarantees. Mm-hmm. In addition, I think we forget history here. I mean, I think a lot of Americans have less and less knowledge of history in general, our own and others, but this is not an area that is studied extensively. The Ukrainians have a long history with the Russians, and that is an incredibly brutal history. And you can see that repeated in the Russian invasion this last time. They're currently targeting civilian areas. I went to the funeral of a mother and a 7-month-old baby that were in an apartment building. They were 2 of 12 people killed. While we were there was another strike on Odessa that killed 5 people while the president, Zelensky, was there in Odessa. So the willful targeting of civilians, in contrary to the current, what used to be called civilized rules in the world, is the intentional strategy of Putin here. Not to mention, I visited the mass grave in Bucha, north of Kyiv, where the Russians killed civilians as they occupied the area, and just on the streets, people trying to get food, trying to find family, people trying to get out of the area. The Russians just shot them in the street so much, and then they couldn't bury them, so they were placed in a mass grave. The numerous reports of torture and rape and the stealing of children by the Russians. I mean, if you want to say, okay, well, let's just call it quits and we'll all just be, they know what being under the power of Putin's Russia is today. It's suicide. It's torture. So when you ask them, well, why don't you just kind of accept conquest in certain areas, or the risk that any stoppage of the battle will be a chance for the Russians to reload and come back. We ought to realize what we're asking them, and whether we'd ask that of our own citizens, and whether it makes sense for people to agree to something like that. I think there's no question that the Ukrainians will fight, because they know the alternative to fighting is torture and death for too many of them. So, we ask about will. I don't think that's a question for the Ukrainians. Now, again, they have taken serious losses of men in this battle. It's been a brutal front. And again, we're making it more brutal by not giving them the weapon systems they need. They're talking about 1,000 of the long-range ATACMS artillery rockets could radically transform the Russians' ability to fight with them, because they would use them to cut off logistics and push back the strike capability of the Russians. I think we ought to give them that. And the arguments that have been offered about not doing this or saving these for Taiwan, there's some arguments in Washington that are so stupid. I think people who make them should be ashamed, and that is it. We ought to surrender Israel. We ought to surrender Ukraine to show we're serious about the Chinese threat to Taiwan. That's not a strategy. That's a kind of misunderstanding of what it takes to deter China, and it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the alliance system is about. if the power of countries in the modern sense is their economic strength to buy military technology to defend themselves, the combined GDP of the United States and Europe vastly dwarfs Russia, China, and Iran. That's why the alliance or the axis of evil today is attacking Ukraine. That's why it's going after the Middle East. If you take the democracies in the Indo-Pacific, Israel, Europe, and the United States, we have the economic power, which means we have the potential military power to dominate these adversaries. What are they trying to do? They're trying to pick us off one at a time. They're trying to use misunderstanding and some political confusion, and I think in the United States, to gain an upper hand and to take off parts of the world that make them strategically powerful for the next 25 to 50 years. They can't win unless they do that. And I think we ought to be aware that they have a strategic plan, and it's not just troublemaking around the edges. They are trying to break the ability of democracies to defend themselves into the future.
I think the juxtaposition of allied economic power with Axis, in this case, economic power, brings to mind the obvious problem that political will actually matters here. And clearly the Axis powers in this case have gone on a wartime footing in a way that the allies haven't. So how do you see across administrations, across alliance systems, across geographies, allies making the transition to using the power they have the same way that the Axis has clearly taken a weak deck and turned it up to 100 and mixed the metaphor a couple of different ways? Because that's clearly the difference in what's happening here.
Yeah. Again, they're pressing on a number of fronts, and where they find a lack of resistance, they are trying to press further. You know, it's the old push on a bayonet. When you get mush, keep pushing. When you hit steel, stop. I was struck when I came back from Taiwan that there's a kind of unavoidable contrast between the way we are confronting China, Russia in particular, and the way we did during the part of the Cold War that made the Soviet Union decline. And that is, we attacked on three fronts during the Reagan administration, which is, I think, a key and pivotal time for the United States in this kind of struggle. To simplify it a bit, one, we build our military. We strengthen the military capacity here, and we need to do that today. The current budget of the Biden administration is not adequate, although I think part of this has to be a kind of transition. We can talk about that if you want, but basically you've got to have in an age of hard power, you got to have hard power. So we need to build that, and we need to build that effectively. That's what Ukraine's trying to do within their own capacities. That's what Israel's trying to do within its capacities, and we need to help them and support them. We need to build our own power because we're the large hard power supplier in our democratic alliances. But secondly, the Reagan administration used economic power. It didn't just use sanctions. It kind of broke the economic strength of the Soviet Union in cooperation, frankly, with Saudi Arabians, pumping oil and reducing the price, going after sanctions to reduce capacity for access to things at that time were critical, like computers and other technology. Despite the fact that the Soviets were trying to steal some of that, we even put famously false plans into the Soviets' hands that caused them to build some technology that blew up and was destructive and created loss for them. We ought to play hardball here on that too. But we ought to have systematic efforts to cause economic weakness, because that economic strength is the feeder for military hard power. And thirdly, we use political power. I mean, Reagan was famous for being criticized by saying, you're being too bellicose, you're being too. But what is the greatest threat to oligarchies and tyrants? Their own people. The estimates are that the Chinese communist regime spends as much trying to maintain internal security as it does on its external effort. They're telling us something. So is Putin. Huge effort, secret police, internal controls. Those people are our allies. We can speak to them. When's the last time the President of the United States said that these leaders are not the legitimate authority of their country? They are tyrants. They are oligarchs.
Well, I'd say the last time President Biden said that Putin had to go, and there was a whole kerfuffle there. But I think that was clearly an off-the-cuff remark. So you're talking about a dedicated, specific strategy oriented around that political case.
Yeah, I think what happens is you see this, somehow the kind of truth blurts out. I mean, President Biden occasionally says, Xi Jinping's is a tyrant, right? But it's almost like his common sense overwhelms the talking points that he's given here. We ought to say clearly that we're on the side of the people who are being oppressed here, because they are being oppressed. And that helps to weaken these regimes and their hold on power. And I think the failure to do that in Iran, in Russia, in China, and frankly, even in North Korea, we have parked one of the most potent and absolutely no cost weapon we have here, and it's just some kind of misunderstanding and misguidedness. Maybe it's a little moral cowardice, but this is an enormously important tool. The economic feeding of these tyrants by the West is something we need to continue to choke off. We cannot give billions of dollars to the Iranian regime. We cannot continue to allow economic exchanges that bypass the sanctions. If you're going to use sanctions, they have to be real, and they have to be more than just trade sanctions. They're going to have to be really systematic and strategic deprivation of currency. We've done some work here at Hudson talking about the weakness, for example, of the Chinese Communist regime. And it's much more fragile than people realize. And we're talking about, and we're developing strategies for targeting the weaknesses in that regime. That's what it means to really engage here. And that's what it means to use power in a way that turns the tables on our adversaries and breaks them down. That's, you don't always have to yell about that, but you got to do it. And, there's a lot of controversy about positions of President Biden and former President Trump. But one of the things that President Trump did that I was always struck by was he talked about Xi Jinping as his buddy, and yet he completely changed the attitude of the West about China from it's a market, it's a business partner, to it's an adversary and a threat. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a kind of I'm going to speak nicely to him, and it's not using the political power that Reagan did, but it was the precondition of changing the understanding of a benignness to the Chinese regime, to an adversary. Now we are aware of that. Now it's time to be, I think, much more tough about the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians. And that's not the way the Biden administration is acting.
I want to speak to something you said earlier. You related the idea that we need to, in some ways, sacrifice Ukraine and Israel from a support perspective for Taiwan as being akin to surrender. I guess what I would ask you, and I'm asking you this because in the piece you wrote about your recent trips, you really likened this period of our history right after the 1970s, the lack of confidence, the feeling of limits, the understating of America's strength relative to our adversaries. What is the difference between surrender and prudence? Because during eras of limits, because I think at their best, the critics who you were referring to are basically saying, look, we say we want to produce X goods in Y amount of time. We can't do that. It's not 1941. So when we are saying we need to allocate resources to Taiwan, that's not us being surrender monkeys. It's us just actually saying, hey, this is all we can do. So how should we understand limits in a period like now?
Well, I think there certainly are limits, but we're also limited. My point is we're creating limits for ourselves that are not necessary. It doesn't cost anything to say the Xi Jinping is a tyrant. Xi Jinping does not represent the legitimate aspirations of the Chinese people. It doesn't cost anything to say that Vladimir Putin is a tyrant and a kleptocrat. He is stealing and distorting the Russian nation in a way that is horrifying. And killing political opponents and sending men to their death without regard to the safety of their own soldiers and citizens. That's the truth. I mean, I know sometimes people don't like to talk about the truth because somehow it seems so black and white. But this is unavoidable. These are not debatable propositions. They're obvious to everybody. And when you state them, that undermines the capacity and the political power of our adversaries. So do it. Now, if you want to talk about, okay, well, what about our ability to shift military equipment from one theater to another theater? First of all, what is going to defend Taiwan is kind of talked about as if we're going to send them Stingers and tanks, and that's going to defend Taiwan. That's not going to be adequate. So all this—
There's a bigger problem that's happened if we're talking about Stingers and tanks.
And to say that, well, we're not going to give tanks to Ukraine, or we're not going to give Stingers, or we're not going to give support to Israel because we have to defend Taiwan. And there are people who have backgrounds that should know better in Washington, as you know, who are saying this stuff and saying it a lot to defend a policy or an attitude in some political sectors of the Democrat and the Republican Party, to say, well, we don't want to fight here. We don't want to spend the money, or we don't want to engage in hard decisions about American security. What these countries need are capacities that we have. And what people don't realize is sometimes in the way this is debated, some of the equipment that we're giving Ukraine, for example, some of the rocket artillery, for example, they used in October. It was already expired. These systems have an expiration date. The chemicals, the other components wear out. So what we did is we gave ourselves the equivalent of the money that was configured for these systems. Many of them were going obsolete now or soon, and we bought new ones with the money. So this was essentially something that we took expendable, expiring equipment and put it in the hands of people who are killing our adversary. Now, in other circumstances, this would be something where people would be flabbergasted to say there's a problem with that. Mm-hmm. Again, moving that equipment to Taiwan for a war in the next 3 to 5 years is not adequate, and it's not the equipment they need. If China comes across the strait, we need American hard power, and that means projections of naval power into the Indo-Pacific. And it means, as our work is showing, we need new systems that involve, in some cases, unmanned and unmanned autonomous systems that can be produced quickly and in large numbers, and can be used in these areas to both prevent a successful attack on Taiwan, but also to deter, because it shows we can affect it. Again, if you can deter something with something you keep secret from your enemy, it's not going to deter them. So we are talking about this in the open to try to say, look, this is what we can do with our allies to prevent to reduce the possibility of a successful attack on Taiwan. And that is designed to protect Taiwan. That's the way to do this. Not to say, well, we don't want to antagonize China because it'll take Taiwan now. We don't want to defend our allies in the Middle East and in Europe because the equipment there is going to be has to be given to Taiwan, which, by the way, we still can't win in Taiwan. I mean, there is a surrender monkey element to this argument. And I think, I know that's rhetorical. I know that's cheap in some ways, but when you start listening to some of this talk, the only conclusion from this talk is we're going to lose, and that's wrong. We're not going to lose. And when you look at what capacities we have here and the weakness of our adversaries, that's a very dangerous position to make, because it's false and it empowers a threat to the American people.
I want to put this very precisely because I think you've set this up very well. At a core level, if our objective, and this is what everyone agrees, everyone's agreed on the following point, our objective is to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Clearly, I don't see anyone contesting this. A CCP decision to invade is not going to be based on the number of Stingers we have available or ATACMS or tanks. What are the actual balances of military power and technological capacity that we should actually be looking at when measuring deterrence? We're also noting, as you said at the start of the episode, that deterrence isn't just this wall you build and it's static, it's going to change and flow. But how should we measure deterrence if we're not measuring it by the number of Stingers we could ship across the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think we have to maintain our ability to project force. That begins with the Navy in this case and the Air Force. We have to maintain the capacity to strike in that region and, frankly, into China. It also means we have to maintain our nuclear deterrence. At the end of the day, China is building a greater nuclear capacity. Obviously, they're not doing that for their own version of 4th of July fireworks. They're going to do that to try to threaten us and try to create a strategic situation that deters us if they want to expand. So we need to build that deterrence. There just was a strategic posture report. Some Hudson people participated in that commission that was set up by Congress. And we need to make sure that we have reliable strategic deterrent, both for Russia and for China. And frankly, we have to prevent Iran and North Korea from getting too far out of the box here. And that requires us to have the ultimate threat here, which is, people don't like to talk about, but that is the thing that has kept us from having war since the end of World War II. So I think that's important to maintain and not forget. There's been a reluctance to spend on that, and I think that has to change. But I also think we have to use the technology. I mean, again, Ukraine is showing that artificial intelligence, systems that are enabled with sophisticated network capability that involves electronic warfare, as well as the ability to operate in swarms and in strike packages, combining air, land, and sea battle and undersea battle. I mean, we can do a lot of we're doing work on autonomous systems that are undersea systems that, especially in the Taiwan Strait, are very powerful for deterrence. I mean, look, what you want to do is essentially, in the area that Taiwan is vulnerable, is show you have the capacity to create what is sometimes called a kill box. You go into that box, you're dead. And that's creates a problem for an attack on Taiwan. But it also, I think, requires us, and we're looking more broadly, we're looking at is creating capacities, and it's great to see Japan looking at becoming more active. It's great to see, we want to move AUKUS along as a combination of Australia and the UK. We want to work with the Philippines and as well as Taiwan. And look, frankly, I think we need to be as rapidly as possible working in a separate way with India on this. India is not going to want to be NATO, but India has a strategic threat that it needs to work on too, and we can be helpful there. So you can create various capacities, especially with the technology, a technology that a number of these countries have. South Korea has this, Japan has this. They know how to make electronically sophisticated systems. They can do some of them on their own. They can do some of them that will network into our systems. They can multiply the problem for the Chinese communists. Multiplying that problem makes us safer. And we should realize the enormous capacity and frankly, innovative capability of democratic peoples. They're wealthier, they're more innovative, and it unleashes the capacity of those people to help in their nations defend themselves. That's our advantage. And to kind of talk as if, we don't have the advantage or we're worried about forever wars. Deterrence is a kind of forever war. But it's a forever war at a low level that keeps real war from going on.
We had 60 years of deterrence after World War II.
Right.
And no one counts that as a defeat or a inadequate situation. Here's a question I'd love to ask you, since you brought up the nuclear issue, and this speaks actually to Hudson Institute's roots in nuclear strategy when it came to Herman Kahn. It seems to me that one of the most effective strategic actions that Putin took following the invasion was just his use of the nuclear threat. in a way that clearly dictated the politics of the American and NATO response to Ukraine. The ability to just threaten very publicly and very privately. I work in Silicon Valley. I can say that there are a lot of folks in Silicon Valley whose response to the invasion was very much premised on this idea that Russia was that close at any one moment to using a nuclear weapon. That has just basically reintroduced a Cold War style environment that very clearly American society at every level, business, civil, political, otherwise, is not ready for. I can't tell you the number of actual listeners who just reached out to me asking a very basic question of, I know that democracy is real, I care about Ukraine, but nothing is worth the use of a nuclear weapon. That is very much the environment that Putin wanted to shape politically. How do you advise everyone across American society navigate an environment where clearly that's going to be a political dynamic?
Yeah. We've kind of forgotten what it's like to live in an era where there's real deterrence that involves a nuclear threat. I'm so old. I remember being in elementary school and drills where you went under your desk and you knew where fallout shelters were. Fallout shelters, and by the way, civil defense was something that Herman Kahn said we needed to expand the capacity for deterrence to make it harder for our adversaries to be sure that a nuclear war could be successful. I think nobody wants a nuclear war, and that's why we've done all the things we did since the end of the Second World War to deter war and nuclear war in particular. But the only deterrence for nuclear war is to have a conventional capacity to overwhelm Russian threats of the conventional kind, and to be willing to stand and say you may not use nuclear weapons. You will face an unacceptable consequence. I think as long as the threat of a nuclear attack is going to cause us to fold up and not defend ourselves, you can expect that threat to increase. Mm-hmm. You can expect that threat. What you're doing if you're giving into that, you're encouraging China to use that threat. We're going to take Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and by the way, if you don't accept that, we're going to take Los Angeles and we're going to take Chicago. Well, okay, if that's the situation you're trying to create, this kind of talk creates it. Mm-hmm. So you have to say we have a capacity to stop a nuclear threat and to overwhelmingly respond to it. What is Putin's problem? He's having trouble conquering Ukraine. Do you really think he wants to go to war with NATO? Do you really think he wants to suffer the consequences of the argument is, well, he'll use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine somewhere. Well, okay, then we have to respond and make it so he decides he doesn't want to do that ever again. And I think that requires us to think about ways of both isolating him as a political figure, but also to think about the ways in which we can respond to this, obviously not with a global strategic exchange, but to say, we're not going to do that. We did this during the Reagan administration. We positioned tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. It was a big controversy, a lot of fighting about this. But what was it to show? That we can create what was called the ladder of deterrence. If you do this at this level, we're going to deter you at this level. And that's going to discourage you from going up the ladder. We have to think about that again, of preparing ourselves to be able to say, what's the problem with this is Herman Kahn's book title, Thinking About the Unthinkable, is, we want not to have this, as you mentioned, people in Silicon Valley contacting you. Yes, we want not to have this. But if we're going to be afraid of words, we're going to be defeated in this. We have to be willing to think it through openly and responsibly, and to say we have capacities to deter this kind of behavior. And we have capacities to speak to other Russian leaders and other Chinese leaders and other people in the countries that are a threat to us, and to make it so that the deterrence expands beyond just crazy actions by desperate tyrants. We have to be aware of that, and I think that's why we need to also to think about how we would isolate the leadership of these countries. We've talked about before in strategic planning, counter force strategies, as well as strategies to now in the information age to cut off the ability to communicate and to link military power to the delivery of that power. We have a lot of capacity we're not using. Partly we don't talk about that because of the nature of the systems that it relies on. But I do think we should do more demonstrations to the extent to which we can of consequences here. Right now, there's too much pulling the covers over your head and hoping it'll go away. That is not deterrence. That is inviting further assault. You don't have to be wild. You don't have to be bellicose, but you have to be firm. In fact, I would prefer some things where we talk less and just do some things. My colleague, Walter Russell Mead, had a column recently in the Wall Street Journal talking about how deterrence in the Middle East by the United States makes us look like a scarecrow that's not working. And he talked about measures to kind of increase that capacity. But he also said what you're going to have to do is kill a couple of crows. I think we ought to do that.
So here's how we'll finish. We need a pivot from the specter of nuclear conflict. I want to give you a chance to kind of give us the greatest hits in the sense that you, per like your governmental experience, have been very, very active on questions of drug legalization, drug decriminalization. You recently had a op-ed in the Free Press with our colleague, former AG Bill Barr, and you actually talked about the fact that over the past few years, very clearly there is a shift in both the consensus around the response to drug usage in this country. I'd like to really just get folks to, hear, in terms of the work that you really do at Hudson, where you would assess the current state of affairs. If you are a state legislator in Oregon and you think you had this approach in 2020, and now you've recognized very clearly that no longer works, and even in a very blue state, where would you just say the temperature is in the country in the wake of all this?
Well, I measure that in the basis of whenever there's a recess and members of Congress go back to their districts, meet constituents, do town halls and stuff, there's always a flurry of calls to our government affairs office or to me from offices on the Hill saying, we went back home and we wanted to talk about the economy, we wanted to talk about foreign policy, we wanted to talk about something else. And people are stopping us and saying, hey, wait a minute. My brother died of a drug overdose. My sister is living on the street because of drugs, because of fentanyl, because of heroin, because of other drugs. I care about all those other things, but I really care about my family and what's happening here. And what's happened here is two things that have come together. One is the movement of these dangerous drugs, fentanyl in particular, into the United States, assisted by the Chinese Communist government. They have used some criminal organizations, but they have moved the chemicals that are used to make fentanyl and raw fentanyl into Mexico and used the distribution systems that the cartels had into the United States to create a never-before-seen tragedy in the United States of over 100,000 people dying of drug overdoses. 80% of those roughly are fentanyl, although they're polydrug use. And we don't even count anymore how many people are addicted, how many people. Look at what's happening in any major urban area with the people living on the street. You might as well now take all the money you're spending on homelessness and just, redirect it, because you can't get people off the street. You can't get them into a channel for rehabilitation effectively. I do think, I worked a lot of my life, as you pointed out, in drug policy going back to the Reagan administration and both Bush administrations. And we spent a lot of time trying to do a balanced strategy between prevention, rehabilitation, and stopping the supply of drugs. But now it's all driven by supply. As long as this is being driven into the country in unprecedented amounts and unprecedented drops in cost, this is just dominating things. So one, essentially, it's now, I think we need to understand it as a mass poisoning, and it's being done by our adversaries and being done by criminal proxies of those adversaries in Mexico. Chinese are even doing money laundering now, famously for these groups, and that's billions and billions of dollars now. The second part that came together was a view that, we shouldn't be so concerned about stopping and punishing drug sales and drug use. We should be more tolerant. There'd be less harm if we just let people use drugs. Now, I think that was always silly and wrong and visibly wrong. But we had this argument beginning, I think, most directly in the Obama administration of let's just suppress the enforcement, start in Colorado and encouraged other areas, marijuana, but also then, what you saw, as you pointed out, in some of the West Coast states, we're just really not going to enforce the law, or we're going to repeal the state law, and the federal government's not going to enter. Well, the spread of pathology has just been, self-destructiveness has just been unprecedented. I mean, it really is kind of a walk into Dante's Inferno in some of these areas. There's been eyewitness talk. There's been videos. I mean, you can't say, people haven't seen what is at stake. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse in almost every part of the country because of the spread of drugs, but also because the spread of legalization, which began with marijuana. Well, it's like all Cheech and Chong, funny guys. We're all big, especially the elite, went to college. They blew some weed. I'm fine. It's all right. Well, first of all, there's an industrial component. So it's going to be in a variety of forms, in a variety of potency, a variety of expense. And yes, this is like alcohol. Some people can handle it. And if you started handing it out, at the on the street corner, you'd have a lot more alcoholism. So we don't control it. And these drugs are more potent. They're more powerful. They're more dangerous. And they're also, in all cases, they reach young people, which are much more susceptible. We have all kinds of science and biochemical knowledge, and we have the ability to understand what's happening here, and we're playing dumb. Now it's harder to play dumb. It's harder to play dumb because you walk by this on your way to work, and it's a terribly destructive thing for, I think, the American people. Yeah, I mean, you act like we're in some kind of desperately poor country somewhere where people are dying on the street, which is what they're doing, and we just walk over them and walk away. I mean, I don't think that's the way most people want to think about America, that we reach out and help people, we get them back. But these things take such a hard hold on their lives. They can't do this alone. Say, well, we're going to hit bottom. They're not going to hit bottom. They're going to die. And they're dying in large numbers. They're dying in numbers now that exceeds the death toll at the worst years of war in the World War II for Americans. So, it's way beyond total in Vietnam, way beyond other kinds of tragedies in American life. So, yeah, it's horrible that it took this long, and we still don't have a policy to change it. But we're going to have to stop the poisoning, both the poisoning aggressively inserted in our country by criminal organizations supported by the Chinese communists, but also we're going to have to stop the poison that we've allowed to have grown up. That won't be easy because there's a lot of money behind it. And there's also people who want to use drugs. I mean, they're just, it's like, it's like telling people they can't get their fix. They don't act indifferent when you tell them that. They fight. And they'll do anything. I mean, look, that's what we kind of don't connect the dots here. People will debase themselves. They'll give up anything. They'll betray their family. They'll harm their children and abandon them because these things have such a grip on human nature. Now, we know that. Most people I know have had family members and friends who've gone through this. They've lost people now. So we have to actualize the knowledge we have and realize that we're going to have to make some significant changes. I think that is somewhat coming. The faster, the better.
That's an excellent place to end. I thought that was going to be a bit of a segue, but I think it gets at the big geopolitical questions you're analyzing at Hudson. But I think your point around constituent services and actually what's driving folks on the ground is incredibly important. John Walters, thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you, Marshall. Good to be with you.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.